rather profound conversation. And I emphasize the word conversation because this is, I guess, as I was saying to one of our speakers, an opportunity for us to understand that we can disagree, but we can have conversations that bring us closer together in terms of understanding each other and recognizing kind of where people are coming from. My pastor at North Presbyterian Church likes to talk about faith and the fact that faith, the opposite of faith is not doubt. The opposite of faith is certainty. If you certainly know something, then you have no room for faith. But if you doubt, then you're open to faith. And this is an opportunity for us to have that discussion, that conversation that hopefully will bring us closer together in terms of how we live our lives and how we live in this community. Basically, at this particular point, the format, I believe, is in your program. We will have the opening statements followed by rebuttal time. There will be something called cross-examination and closings, and then we will have opportunity for questions and answers a little bit later in the process. But you're not here to hear me. You're here to hear our speakers. So with that, we will begin with Abdu and his presentation.
Make sure there we go. Well, thank you, Your Honor, for that introduction, and for all of you for coming. Thank you for the Secular Student Alliance, Ratio Christi, and all who are involved in this. And John, I want to thank you especially for agreeing to do this debate with me. It's an honor to share the stage with you. I met John about 6 or 7 years ago, maybe even longer than that, in Providence, Rhode Island. I was at an ETS conference, which is just a fancy, nerdy Christian conference. And after that was another conference, an apologetics conference. And a friend of mine, Paul Copan, said, "Hey, Abdu, are you staying for that apologetics conference afterward?" And I said, "Yeah, I actually am." He says, "Do you have a room with an extra bed?" I said, "Yeah, I've got a room, extra bed." "Do you have a car to get around in?" I said, "Yeah, Paul, whatever you need. Room, bed, car, you got it." He goes, "Great, John Loftus is coming. He needs a place to stay." It was my honor to host him. We got to know each other a little bit, and we got to know each other a little bit more today. And we were engaging on some topics. And I asked, "John, do you have something written down?" He says, "Yes, I have my book." I said, "Great." And he said, $20. I'm kidding, actually. I think I was remembering it this evening. John actually offered it to me, and I insisted on paying for it. And he gratefully, I'm glad he did accept that. And I've been grateful for that. Did Jesus rise is the question we're talking about. But the question you have to ask yourself, and it's a rhetorical question, is why are you here? Some of you are here to see John beat me. Some of you are here to see me beat John. Some of you are actually on the fence. Why are you here? Now, in prior debates, and I assume today to some degree, John will go into the idea of confirmation bias. What confirmation bias is that people tend, from different perspectives, to look at evidence differently. People who want to believe it one way will look at it and discount some things and affirm other things that happen to conform to their worldview. That's how confirmation bias works. Everyone is subject to confirmation bias. I know John has spent some time chiding Christians for being guilty of confirmation bias and not really examining the other evidence. And he said in prior debates that if you hear him as a Christian, you'll just discount what he says because you don't want to believe what he has to offer. The reality is that everyone in this room, you, me, John Loftus, is subject to confirmation bias. Some of us want to be atheists, like philosopher Thomas Nagel. We hate the idea of God and so cling to atheism despite its problems. Or we want Christianity to be false because of some moral choice we want to make, have made, or trouble in the church, whatever it is. There's a million reasons to be a disbeliever, and there's a million reasons to be a believer. And most of them are personal. Now, John might say, I was once a Christian philosopher or a Christian who lost my faith because I looked at the evidence, overcame my confirmation bias, saw the evidence, saw it was lacking. I have two responses to this. We're both still subject to this. I make a living based on preaching the gospel. That's what I do. John makes at least part of his living, if not all of it, on his many books that he's written, debunking Christianity. He's got a website called Debunking Christianity. So we both have a vested interest in looking at the evidence the way we'd like to look at it. But I will tell you this. I didn't come to the faith of Christianity willingly, at least not originally. I was a Muslim, and I very much didn't like the idea of Jesus' death and his resurrection specifically, and the gospel in general. So I didn't want to believe it. But over the course of a long search, I began to see that I thought the evidence was really there. There was going to be consequences to my belief, some bad consequences. One, I'd lose my identity. Two, I had to change my worldview, and that's really hard to do. And three, there'd be other consequences as well. I won't go into that. But I saw the evidence and the strength of it, and it moved me, and it changed my life, but it also was beautiful in its truth. And I thought it was truly beautiful. So my argument for you today about the evidence is this. I think the resurrection is the best explanation for the evidence of what happened to Jesus based on facts acknowledged by the majority of scholars, Christian and non-Christian, studying the subject. Now, what is that evidence? Well, we have a couple of facts about Jesus that we know about. One is that he was crucified and he died. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I think, if I'm not mistaken, John and I actually agree. Jesus died. He thinks he stayed dead. I think he actually died and rose. But we don't disagree on this. Jesus died by crucifixion. So that's the first part. Now, why do I bring that up? Because in order to rise from the dead, you've got to be dead first. That's kind of how it works. But the next part is the rub, the appearances. I believe that there is evidence, and the vast majority of scholars studying the subject, Christian and non-Christian, will acknowledge that the disciples and Paul had experiences that that convinced them that Jesus had risen from the dead after his crucifixion. What are the sources for this? We have primary sources, we have secondary sources, and these kind of things. I'm going to focus on some sources because we don't have time to focus on all the sources, but here's some sources I want to focus on. One is the Gospels. I think the Gospels, and the majority of scholars will tell you that some of the Gospels have some wonderful evidence in them, first-hand accounts. This is not, I didn't even turn it on, so that will help a lot, I think. We have the Gospels. Most scholars will tell you, the majority of scholars will tell you that Mark's Gospel is based on Peter's account, the Apostle Peter's account. Now, I have a friend, his name is J. Warner Wallace. Jim Wallace is a very famous homicide detective. He's famous enough to be on Dateline numerous times because of the number of cold cases he solves. Keith Morrison calls him the evidence whisperer. He was a dyed-in-the-wool hardcore atheist until age 35, I believe it was. Now, he is an expert in analyzing whether certain statements are eyewitness testimony or fabrications. And at the age of 35, he employed a technique called forensic statement analysis, and he did it on the Gospel of Mark. And having concluded that the Gospel of Mark is indeed based on eyewitness testimony from Peter, among others, he gave his life to Jesus, believing in the resurrection on the strength of that evidence as a dyed-in-the-wool atheist. Next, we have the Gospel of Luke. The Gospel of Luke has several sources. The majority of scholars will tell you the Gospel of Luke has Paul as one of his sources, the Apostle Paul, who's eyewitness to the resurrection. Q, which is a theoretical source that Matthew and Luke drew on. And Mark itself, the Gospel of Mark, which is based on Peter, and it has some eyewitness testimony of its own. Let me give you an example of this. If you look at Luke chapter 24, you see this story of Jesus talking with, he comes to, after his resurrection, two disciples on the road to a thing called Emmaus. And in the story, Jesus' identity is occluded from them, but Luke goes out and mentions one person's name. He mentions Cleopas as one of the guys. Now, why does he mention Cleopas? He's not an important disciple. He doesn't have a record after him of anything. Why did he do that? Many scholars will tell you, Richard Bauckham as one example, will tell you that the reason why Luke mentions him, and this is one example of this, is because Cleopas told him the story. Cleopas is the eyewitness upon which Luke writes the basis. And if you read it with that in mind, you actually look at the story now and you can begin to see it sounds like Cleopas is telling the story. It's an eyewitness account. And then the Gospel of John. The Gospel of John, the majority of scholars will tell you that John's Gospel is based on one of the disciples. Some say it's the Apostle John. Others say it's at least one of the disciples. So we have these accounts. The Gospels tell you about the life, the death, and the resurrection. Every single one of them says this about Jesus, and they're based on these accounts which result from eyewitness accounts. And then we have Paul's testimony. Paul, by his own admission, was a persecutor of the church who became a Christian after having seen with his own eyes the resurrected Jesus. And he says that he converted from that hostility to Christianity based on that. Now, What happens with Paul? It's interesting when you see what goes on with Paul. He claims to have seen the risen Christ. In Galatians, another letter of Paul, Paul goes and says that he spent time, 15 days, with Peter and James. He spends time with them. And spending 2 weeks with Peter and James, my guess is in 15 weeks, Jesus came up. 15 days. That Jesus came up once in a while. And they didn't change his gospel. In other words, he said, I saw him raised. They gave him the right hand of fellowship. He says in the same book that 14 years after his conversion, he went to Jerusalem, saw Peter and James again, but also now John. They discussed the gospel, and he says, and they added nothing to me. They did not change a thing about what I was saying. So he was preaching the risen Christ based on his eyewitness testimony. They were doing the same thing, and they were agreeing on this. Now, you might say, and I'm a lawyer, so I'm a little bit skeptical of these things. I'm a little cynical. Maybe Paul's lying. Maybe Paul didn't go and do this. Maybe Paul didn't get his doctrine and his eyewitness testimony certified by the disciples of Jesus. I want another witness. We have two. We have Clement of Rome. Clement of Rome is a disciple of Peter. And as a disciple of Peter, he knows what Peter teaches. Clement says that Paul is on a par. His authority is on par with Peter himself. So Clement certifies what Paul said. He could have said Paul's lying. He didn't say it. He said the opposite. Paul is on par with Peter. Then we have Polycarp. Polycarp was a disciple of John, the Apostle John. Polycarp thinks so highly of Paul that he calls his letters sacred scripture. So he clearly thinks that Paul and John are teaching the same thing. So we have eyewitnesses, James, Peter, and John. Paul, an eyewitness, they certify the stories, and we have witnesses who certify that the witnesses saw what they saw. Pretty good stuff, I think. Now, what does Paul give us? In addition to his confession of seeing the risen Christ throughout his letters, we see in 1 Corinthians 15, the undisputed letter of Paul, 3 through 8, a creed that Paul passes down. Now, if you look at those passages in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 to 8, you see that there's a creed that he passes down. Most scholars think it's a creed that predated Paul's letter by quite some time. It was about 3 to 5 years after the crucifixion itself. One scholar, James Dunn, thinks that that creed that was passed down to within 18 months after Jesus died. Pretty early stuff. You freshmen, you seniors and you juniors know, remember the day you first started here? That was 3 years ago or so. That was a blink. That's the time difference between when this creed, when Jesus died and the creed was circulated. And what does the creed say? The creed says that Jesus died according to the scriptures. He was buried. He was raised. He appeared to Peter or Cephas. Then he appeared to James, then the 12, then the 500, and then to Paul. That was circulating publicly within the Christian community between 18 months and 5 years after the crucifixion itself. We have tons of great evidence, I think, that people in that era actually were convinced they saw Jesus risen from the dead. Now, we know they believed it with a strong conviction or willing to suffer and die from it. Some, in fact, did actually suffer and die for it. Others were just willing to do that, and we know this based on that history. In fact, so strong is that history that non-Christians, like atheist Gerd Ludemann, not a Christian, he's an atheist, says, it may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. Rudolf Bultmann agreed that historical criticism can establish, quote, the fact that the first disciples came to believe in the resurrection. Paula Fredrickson, who's not a Christian, who's a professor of history out of the University of Boston, I think that she's now actually, or Boston University, she's now at Hebrew University, I believe, she said, the disciples' conviction that they had seen the risen Christ are facts known past doubting. And in fact, in an interview with Peter Jennings, she made this statement. I know in their own terms what they saw was the raised Jesus. That's what they say, and then all the historic evidence we have afterwards attests to their conviction that that's what they saw. I'm not saying they really did see the raised Jesus. I wasn't there. I don't know what they saw, but I do know that as a historian, they must have seen something that convinced them that Jesus was not just a survivor or the twin or whatever it is, but that he was the risen Christ. Pretty good stuff. Now you might be saying, well, a lot of the testimony comes from Christians. Certainly not these folks. These are all non-Christians who I just quoted to you. But Peter and James, and these are all Christians. Of course they say this. Well, it would be funny, wouldn't it, if someone saw the risen Jesus, they knew he died, saw him raised, or saw him risen, and he says, follow me. And they're like, nah, no thanks. I don't buy it. That'd be a strange thing. You think that they would actually follow Jesus. Why? Because he rose from the dead. And guys who rise from the dead have credibility. But we have something more than that. We have more than just those folks. Let's say you wanted a hostile witness, someone who was a skeptic, who was not only a skeptic, but also someone who hated the church and wanted it destroyed. Now, what if that guy saw the risen Jesus and he converted? Wouldn't that be something? You know, as a trial lawyer, I'll tell you, one of the things you look for as a trial lawyer is that kind of testimony. You find someone who's disputed your case over and over again throughout the whole case, and then they suddenly change their mind based on the evidence that they see, and they say, you know what, you're actually right. Well, my goodness, you put that person on the stand and you let them sing their song all day and all night, if the judge will let you do it, as long as possible for the jury, you, the jury, to see it, to hear it. We have that kind of testimony in two people. James, Jesus' brother, to one degree, and Paul to a greater degree. The evidence shows that James was a skeptic of his brother Jesus. He didn't believe him. He thought he was kind of a kook. I have the references there on the slide. But James becomes the leader of the Jerusalem church after seeing the risen Jesus. Now, Paul is another story altogether. Paul hated the church. By his own admission and by scholarly consensus, Paul persecuted the Christian church, and then he converted based on his claim that he saw the risen Jesus. That's pretty great. That's the kind of testimony that trial lawyers drool over. Now, you'd have to invent a highly unlikely story to account for these conversions. Both James and Paul especially, had every reason not to convert, except for the fact that they truly believed that they saw the bodily risen Jesus. Friends, as I bring this closer to a conclusion now, what we've seen is that, one, Jesus died by crucifixion. Not really a matter of dispute. Two, that he appeared bodily to his disciples. We know about the disciples that he appeared to. We see them in the gospel accounts. We see them in Paul's letters. We see that in the earliest tradition of the church, in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 to 8, Paul tells us about that creed that got passed down. By the way, you know it's a creed for another reason too. A couple of reasons that most scholars think it's a creed. One, it has a certain parallelism and a rhyme and a meter, not a rhyme, but a meter to it that shows that it's a creed. It doesn't fit with the Pauline structure of his letter, and so many scholars do believe that it was something that predated Paul himself. Early stuff. So he's crucified, he appeared, and the strength of that appearance, what his disciples saw, was so great that they were willing to suffer and die for that belief. And we know, for example, that Paul gave his life in service of that belief. Now, these are evidences, these are things that the majority of scholars agree on, Christian and non-Christian. These three facts, crucifixion, appearances, and the skeptics converted. These three facts cry out for an explanation. They cry out for one. And I think the best explanation is the resurrection. It accounts for all the data, and it accounts for all the data without being ad hoc or speculative, or sort of just made up out of thin air. Now, does this explanation defy our common experience of the natural world? Well, of course it does. You see, science and our observations through science is a marvelous tool for telling us about how nature works when it's left to itself. But a miracle, by definition, happens when nature is not left to itself. So these other issues, if you say, oh, science disproves these things exist, well, it doesn't even apply in this particular case. I'm a believer in science. It doesn't apply in this case because you're not measuring how nature governs itself. What you're measuring is that against when nature is not left to itself. Now, if you say there's no way nature can't be left to itself, it's got to be left to itself, or miracles are the most highly improbable event possible or explanation possible, what you've done is define your way out of the problem. You've basically said, there's no way miracles can happen, and so no matter how much evidence you show me that one did, I won't believe it. Friends, to say that is to succumb to the very confirmation bias that John Loftus would warn you against, I would warn you against. Any explanation has to take into account all of the core facts. Now, John may try to offer other possible explanations, poke holes in that, but they will not be the best explanation. The resurrection of Jesus from the dead is the best explanation. Thank you.
Good job, Abdu. Good job. I wouldn't want to be facing you as a lawyer, that's for sure. I'm very honored. Oh, by the way, his description of us sleeping together, I deny it. We did not sleep together. A good friend, and I appreciate him very much. So, let me begin. I'm very honored to be here and happy that somebody actually showed up to watch and listen to our debate. I can't wait to hear what I have to say myself. I have a lot of ground to cover, and what I don't cover can be read in my books. The Why I Became an Atheist is my magnum opus, and the most recent book is How to Defend the Christian Faith, Advice from an Atheist. Now, if I say something that you disagree with, then further justification is found in my books, and if you want detailed rebuttals to everything he said, they're there as well. Now I want to start by talking about the state of Christian apologetics, and then I'm going to move into the evidence, the so-called evidence for the resurrection, and I'm going to end by tying it all together. Let me begin with a quote from Ravi in his huge book, The History of Apologetics. The 20th century has seen more clearly than previous periods that apologetics stands or falls with the question of method. Now I'm going to highlight this tonight, something that I don't think very many Christian apologists have considered before. Let's do definitions. Apologetics, defending the Christian faith. Method, developing the most effective strategy for defending the faith. Now I'm going to argue that all apologetics is special pleading. Everything said in defense of Christianity operates by an unreasonable double standard. Apologists treat Christianity differently than they treat the evidences of all other religions that they reject. Case in point has to do with the method itself. One should first come up with the best method to know which religion is true, if there is one. This problem has only recently come to light, and it's significant. In response, apologists are trying to come up with a method after the fact that justifies their faith. Folks, this is just not how you do it, honestly. First comes method, and then the results come as they may. Now, this crisis started in 1953, at least it was called to attention by Bernard Ram in his book, Varieties of Christian Apologetics. 1976, it was commented on by Gordon Lewis. 2000, the debate is still raging with 5 apologetics views in Stephen Cohen's book. And 2006, Kenneth Boa and Robert Bowman commented on it. And those are only just a few of the books. There's actually a spate of them and hundreds of essays and articles. Let's go through these methods. First, the evidential method. And that is historical evidence alone is sufficient to believe Jesus arose from the dead and that God exists. Now, I have no bone to pick with this method. It's the only reasonable method for assessing the truth of religious faiths. It requires sufficient objective evidence to believe. I just disagree that it leads to Christianity. The kicker is that so do most Christian apologists. It's an admitted failure. And Christian apologists are pointing this out. One, without God, miracles aren't likely. Norman Geisler, a proponent of a different method, says the mere fact of the resurrection of Jesus cannot be used to establish the truth that there is a God, for the resurrection cannot even be a miracle unless there already is a God. Lessing's ugly broad ditch. 18th century German critic Gotthold Lessing said, miracles, which I see with my own eyes and which I have opportunity to verify for myself, are one thing. Miracles of which I only know from history that others say that they have seen them are another thing entirely. Bart Ehrman echoes Lessing's thought when he said all that historians can do is show what probably happened in the past. That is the problem inherent in miracles. Miracles, by our very definition of the term, are virtually impossible events. So miracles, by their very nature, are always the least probable explanations for what happened. Now, deists were actually the first modern evidentialists. You probably know of it because deists believe there's only a creator God. Well, actually, that's the conclusion of a method that they chose, and that method was to only believe what was reasonable based on sufficient evidence. And it ended with the rejection of all religious dogma except for the need for a creator. After Darwin's Origin of Species, most deists became atheists because that's where the evidence leads. So we already have an example of evidence, and it leads there. The classical method is another method, one that Norman Geisler helped to pioneer in the last few decades. But what about the... Let's see. There we go. At first, you argue to the existence of God, and then you consider the arguments. Okay, there we go. But do theistic arguments work? I mean, if you have to first argue that God exists, do they work? Well, two of the greatest living Christian apologists are Alvin Plantinga and Richard Swinburne. Plantinga has admitted that theistic arguments don't work, saying, I don't know of an argument for Christian belief that seems very likely to convince one who doesn't already accept its conclusion. If Christian beliefs are true, then the most satisfactory way to hold them will not be as the conclusions of argument. Richard Swinburne specifically rejects the moral argument to God's existence, saying, I cannot see any force in an argument to the existence of God from the existence of morality. Another Christian apologist of note is John Feinberg. He wrote, I am not convinced that any of the traditional arguments for God's existence succeeds. Now, these are Christians saying these things. These are top-notch Christians. Now, if they don't think these arguments work, why should any of us? It's not just me saying this. It's they who are saying this. And even if you do get to a God, which one? We get to a deist God, we get to Allah, we get to a non-personal force, an evil God, a scientific God who is watching over us like rats in a maze. It's just not good enough. Now, the only thing it does admit is that miracles are possible. Now, I, as an atheist, admit miracles are possible, so it doesn't get them anything. What we want to know is whether they happen. And so it ends up being nothing more than a dressed-up evidentialism, the very thing that classical apologists want to avoid because of where it leads. Then there's let's see what it is. Yeah. Then there's the presuppositional method, another method that is currently being debated, where the evidence, I'm getting you lost. The evidence for the resurrection can only be accepted through the lens of Christian assumptions. I must have turned 2 pages here. That's disappointing. Here it is. It's all my own fault, not yours. I want to blame you, but I can't. But where do these assumptions come from? How is it possible to start with assumptions without first looking at the evidence? The evidence must come first. That makes the assumptions carry all the weight as evidence. Consistency means allowing Muslim assumptions as their evidence or Mormon assumptions as their evidence. This non-method tacitly admits there isn't sufficient evidence to believe in the resurrection. Otherwise, it never would have been concocted. And in the end, it just begs the question. Every Christian apologist who rejects this method will say that. It just begs the question. 4, the Reformed method. It's in this position is that it's reasonable to believe in God and the resurrection without the need for and or the existence of sufficient objective evidence. Now, who in their right mind would say such a thing? This is another admission by apologists themselves that there isn't sufficient objective evidence to believe, for if it existed, then this non-method would never have been concocted. And in the end, it actually... Yeah, I'm... Okay. In the end, this method requires psychic abilities because apparently there's a spiritual world that can tell you what happened 3 days after Jesus was crucified. You might as well just hire a medium to tell you. And that's the kind of method this is. Then there's the fideism method. That's faithism. And that is the idea that private subjective experiences of the risen Jesus provide good reasons to believe. But private subjective experiences are only evidence of private subjective experiences. They are only evidence of private subjective states of the mind. They say nothing about the objective world. I don't mean to insult anybody, but this is a method of insanity. Insane people walking in psych wards who say they think that they're Jesus use this same method. And in the end, it's an unreliable method as a historical way to figure out what happened 3 days after Jesus was crucified. Private subjective experiences cannot tell us if historical evidence shows Jesus resurrected. Just think of Custer's last stand. Is there any way to know what happened at Custer's last stand except looking at the evidence? And you'll know what I'm talking about. Lastly, the cumulative method. Now, this method is a recent one, and it puts all the other methods together. It says, let's use a little bit of all the others. And so in this idea, I'm quoting from Wayne House and Dennis Jowers. The apologist needs to be able to employ different approaches in different contexts. Every person will react and be reached differently, so there's no one approach that will work every time. Again, who would ever say such a thing? Apologists are searching for a method that works to convince others rather than one that helps us arrive at the truth. That's the context of what they were writing. It's Exhibit A in revealing the truth about apologetics. The goal is to persuade. The method is special pleading. Whatever works is what they'll adopt. It's the warp and woof of Christian apologists. And I used to be a Christian apologist, and so I actually know what I'm talking about. The cumulative method, however, is like mixing oil and water. I'd like to see someone actually harmonize evidentialism with the classical method with presuppositionalism and fideism. It cannot be done. It's also got a leaky bucket problem. Since they all have gaping holes in them, things I've mentioned earlier, then putting them together doesn't stop the leaks. What's really going on with the cumulative method is that proponents merely agree on the conclusion. And that's it. What we see here are Christians struggling to develop a method that supports their prior faith rather than developing an objective method that leads to the truth about religions. And as you can see, they struggle precisely because they reject evidentialism. So let's rehearse. Evidentialism and admitted failure. I mean, at least that's the problem, that people are developing other methods because. I mean, you wouldn't see any other method arise if the evidential method worked. Classical method back to evidentialism because it doesn't really help to say you got a God. It only admits that the miracles are possible. Presuppositionalism. Reformed, out of order. We mentioned that. Psychic ability, question begging, fideism, the method of insanity, and cumulative case is faith in search of a method. This is what you get with Christian apologetic methods, and that's why it's in crisis today. Now, it's not me saying this, although it is me saying this. It's Christian apologists themselves. You read the literature, you see what they're debating in these books about a methodology, and you'll see that they're actually struggling for a way to justify their faith rather than looking at a good method and seeing what results from it. So the kicker. Since there are 6 major methods, then any given one of them is rejected by 83% of the apologists, if we grant for the moment that they all have the equivalent amount of defenders. That means 83% of the apologists reject the need for and or the existence of sufficient objective evidence. Now, I propose a method. Oh, yeah, well, what would you say if Mormon apologists had that same result? Well, I've actually proposed a method. It's called the outsider test for faith. That the only way to test religious faith is from the perspective of an outsider, applying the same consistent level of reasonable skepticism to them all. And I've defended it in my book. And I suppose that when they take that test, they're not going to actually like what the result is. Sorry. So, do this. Let's do the resurrection of Jesus. Assume you've never heard about Jesus or Christianity, and that Abdu is a missionary from China preaching Yin-Yang, a newly discovered religion. Become outsiders. Become outsiders for the first time in your lives. And why do you do that? Because it's the only way to dispassionately evaluate your culturally inherited religious faith, because we seek to confirm rather than disconfirm our beliefs. Abdu predicted that one. But he's right. And now why do this? Because we depend on familiarity. And here's an example of what I mean. If you're a Christian, you see nothing bizarre about a gospel story involving one member of a Trinitarian God who came down to earth by being born of a virgin, who was 100% God, yet 100% man, to be killed so that the other 2 members of the Trinity could forgive people who believed that story, and then was raised from the dead and ascended into the sky to return to the Trinitarian throne, bringing back to reign with him the sinless man Jesus, who is now forever joined with him at the hip. Or do you? You certainly would if that was the first time you ever heard it, because that's what theologians have concluded. We depend on culture. We are products of our times and indoctrinated into our cultures. Culture isn't even something we see unless we focus on it, for cultures allow us to see in the first place. Cultures are the very lens through which we see the world, and ours are dominated by Christianity, and because our brains lie to us. Cognitive biases get in the way of evaluating your religious faith. The mother of all cognitive biases is confirmation bias, which is a strong tendency to search for data and to interpret existing data in ways that confirm one's prior beliefs. The brain only cares if what it concludes helps it survive. The brain evolved to act this way for self-preservation purposes. It maintains and defends its beliefs so that you can survive as a social creature, since you need others to survive. You will defend the beliefs of your social group in order to stay within the safety net of your social group, irrespective of whether those beliefs are true or not. There's a massive amount of solid research supportive of these undeniable facts. So, given what I've just said, what would it take for you to believe in Abdu's Yingianity? It would take an overwhelming amount of strong historical evidence to overcome our concrete personal experience that dead men stay dead. Now, if you thought that he gave you that, listen to what I've got to say. Let's talk about empirical evidence. Is there any? None. There is no empirical evidence that Jesus rose from the dead, because it supposedly happened in the ancient pre-scientific past in a lone part of the planet before investigative reporters, videos, and cell phones. Where's the textual evidence? There is none. That is, let me clarify, there are no original texts. We have none. We must wait until the 4th century to get any completed manuscripts. They contain forgeries like the pastoral letters, the ending of Mark. You ever read the ending of Mark? It's not there in the original. 2 Peter is one of those forgeries. It's too complicated Greek for a fisherman, and it doesn't match with 1 Peter. And it excludes other Christian writings like the Judaizers. We know nothing about the Judaizers, but Paul was continually battling with them, and the Gnostics. And Bart Ehrman has a couple books on these topics like Lost Scriptures and Lost Christianities. They're there. Those things are there, but they were excluded. Where's the first-hand testimonial experience or evidence? There is none. There were no eyewitnesses to the resurrection, apart from his convoluted, if that's called evidence. No eyewitnesses saw Jesus arise from the dead. You don't deny that, do you? No one was there. No one was there to see and say, I saw Jesus come out of that tomb. Nobody was there. No one could say that. Now, there were no eyewitnesses either that wrote anything. No one wrote anything who saw Jesus arise from the dead. We do not have anything written directly by Jesus himself or his original disciples. All supposed testimonies of the resurrection of Jesus are reported to us by others, which is considered inadmissible and court judged because it's hearsay evidence. Subsequent gospel writers plagiarized upon Mark, the first gospel, so the gospel stories of Jesus' resurrection stand on Mark's gospel alone. Luke and Matthew and John borrowed from Mark. The thing is why that's important is because at the end of Mark's gospel, there isn't a sequence where Jesus shows himself alive after dying. And if Peter was the originator of the Mark's gospel, then Peter didn't tell that story, now did he? There's no chance to question him. You've got to question somebody. That's why hearsay is not allowed in the courtroom. How do we really know what they actually testified to? Did they actually see the risen Jesus as claimed? Did they all tell the same story? Did any of them recant later? We know enough about the Mormon religion to say, well, some of them recanted later, but we don't about the Jesus story. Paul is the only writer to claim that he's seen the risen Jesus, and his letters are the earliest testimony. And on the Damascus Road, he never claimed to have actually seen or touched Jesus. He specifically said it was a visionary experience, and they had plenty of visionary experiences and revelations. He says he had the Lord's Supper revealed to him in a vision. He even said that the gospel itself was revealed to him in a vision. The book of Revelation was dictated 7 letters to 7 churches in the first two, in the chapters 2 and 3, and that was delivered in a vision. Now, if someone came up to you tomorrow and said, I had a vision and I got 7 letters to 7 churches, would you believe that? Those are private, subjective experiences, and there's no reason to believe them. Let me go on. Where's the prophetic evidence? There is none. Looks like I got to go faster here. Now, if you want to see that defended, you need to read my books, because I've got to move on. There is no prophetic evidence. I defy someone to come up with one statement in the Old Testament that is specifically fulfilled in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus that can be legitimately understood as a prophecy and singularly points to Jesus as the Messiah using today's historical, grammatical, hermeneutical method, and I claim it cannot be done. There's no prophecy of a Trinitarian God, no prophecy of an incarnation of a virgin birth, no prophecy of a dying Messiah. The suffering servant is about Israel. And the Psalms are only devotional prayers. They were not intended to be a prophecy. They're taken out of context when the New Testament uses them. And corroborative evidence. Where's the corroborative evidence? There is none. Again, you know how many times this phrase pops up? There is none? A lot. Because it's true. Nothing is said. We have nothing from contemporaries. We don't have anything written by the Jewish leaders or by the Romans that mentions Jesus, the content of his preaching, why he was killed, or what they thought about claims that he had been resurrected. Now, wouldn't you want to know, when assessing the truth of whether Jesus rose from the dead, what they said? We don't have that evidence. You know they said something because they weren't converted. We just don't have that evidence. Either it was squelched or it wasn't available. But wouldn't you want to know what they said? They said something. And no corroborative evidence of bizarre stories of zombies, earthquakes, and eclipses. We have no independent reports that the veil of the temple was torn in two at Jesus' birth or death, nor that darkness came over the whole land from noon till 3, nor that the sun stopped shining, nor that there was an earthquake as death, with another violent one the day he arose from the grave, nor that the saints were raised from death at his resurrection, went into the holy city, and appeared to many people and were never heard from again. Could these events really have occurred without subsequent Roman rabbinic literature mentioning them? These silences are telling. So let's review. No empirical evidence, no original text, no first-hand testimony evidence, no prophetic evidence, no corroborative evidence. Now, case in point, the Jews. They were beloved of God. They believed in God. They believed God does miracles. They were there in the day. They hoped for a Messiah. They knew their prophecies, and they didn't believe. 8 million Jews existed in those days, and what we have is very, very few Jews actually converted. So it's that Paul had to go to the Gentiles to get converts because the Jews wouldn't convert. Now, if you think that counts, then you should consider that. And I just have one thing to say. This is a book written by a Jew, not an atheist. It's the best thing out there. So if you think that believing in God leads you to have more of a desire to believe, then think again. This is Michael Alter's The Resurrection, a Critical Inquiry. One last thing.
Well, I have 10 minutes of rebuttal, so you may want to cover it at that particular point.
All right. I'm not good at time. Thank you so much.
As I indicated, we each have 10 minutes for rebuttal, and then we'll have 7-minute cross-examinations afterwards. Abdu.
Thank you, John. Am I on? Great. Thank you, John, for that. Appreciate it. Someone has to ask, where does one begin? But let me just say this. Literally none of the evidence I presented was addressed. Literally none of it. I presented that there were 3 facts that scholars, the majority of scholars, actually agree upon, whether they're Christian or non-Christian. That Jesus died by crucifixion, not controversial. That Jesus appeared to his disciples, or that the disciples believed, I should say, that they saw something that convinced them that Jesus had risen from the dead. And that conviction was so strong that they're willing to suffer and die for it. That Paul believed he had seen a bodily raised Jesus. A bodily raised Jesus. And that changed him from a staunch enemy of the gospel into its greatest champion. James, the brother of Jesus, was a skeptic and becomes the head of the Jerusalem church. I presented to you a couple of things you see from the gospel evidence. That from the Gospel of Mark, which is based on Peter and other eyewitness testimony, to the Gospel of Luke, which is based on Paul, who was himself an eyewitness, who also draws from Q, who draws from Mark. That's not a problem. I don't think that's a problem in any way, shape, or form. Who, of course, draws his information from Peter himself, and then eyewitnesses as well. And we have indicia of that in the Gospel of Luke. And John. John, who many scholars believe, most scholars actually believe, was based on the eyewitness testimony of one of Jesus' disciples. Now, having seen that, and then Paul's letters, the certifications, the cross certifications, we come to the firm conclusion that Jesus died by crucifixion. That he appeared, there was an appearance, some kind of event that convinced his disciples he was alive again. And that it was so strong that the Apostle Paul, an enemy, became a believer. That's pretty strong evidence. I think it's strong evidence. That's the kind of thing I would put on the stand, especially when we have this forensic statement analysis, which shows, I think, that there are firsthand accounts within those Gospels themselves. None of that was addressed. There was a whole lot of objection thrown up, and it's not even remotely possible to answer all of them. It was going like a tobacco auctioneer over here in terms of how fast he was going. I realized that that's not fair. I mean, I realized that time is the essence, and I myself was rushing through my own presentation. But it's tough to respond to all of those. Let me respond to some of them. Give you an example of a couple of things that I think are just worthy of response. The first thing is this. His definition of miracle is just simply fallacious, and it's a private definition. I think he shares it with Bart Ehrman, but he defined a miracle as the least likely explanation or event possible, and therefore any other naturalistic explanation would do. If you have something that's even remotely possible, naturalistically speaking, that's infinitely more probable than a miracle, because a miracle, by definition, is the least likely event you could have. Now, is that really true? If you were an outsider, and you came to the table 50-50, not having this sort of ad hoc definition of miracle, that it's the least likely event, but maybe one of the possible events, and until I see evidence for it, I won't believe it, you won't have this sort of high, incredibly high hurdle to have to reach over to. You won't have that. You'll have a true, unbiased opinion. If there's enough evidence for a miracle, I'll believe it. It doesn't have to assume God's existence. I don't think that's the case. In fact, the historian can look at the data and say, here's the data we see. And historians of every stripe have done that, and they've seen that. What is the best explanation for the data that Jesus rose? What's the cause of the rising? Well, that's a different story. Was it God? Which God? I don't know. What I can tell you is, based on the evidence, the most reasonable conclusion is that this guy rose from the dead. John asks, did anybody actually see him rise from the dead? We have a statement in the law about circumstantial evidence. I don't have to go outside to know it's raining if it in fact is raining. I can walk in, having it not rain, see somebody walk in with an umbrella that's wet, a raincoat that's wet, and have that person say, it's raining. I have a reasonable conclusion that it's raining. A guy dies, guy's alive 3 days later. Ergo resurrection. I don't have to see it. I can see the living body. That's a good enough reason to believe in a resurrection. I don't have to see it. So miracles are not as defined in the Book of Miracles according to John Loftus. I think that there's plenty of reasons to believe in them separately. But let's look at these other things he talked about. Just a couple of things, and then I'll move on. He talked about the Jews not believing. This is an interesting one to me, because the Christian faith was made up of Jews first. And if Acts 21 is to be believed, there's thousands of Jews who actually did believe. But why didn't they believe? If he says there should have been much more people who believed that the evidence was that strong, why didn't they believe? You know what? Let me give you an answer. I don't know. And you know who else doesn't know? John Loftus. No clue. People disbelieve things for all kinds of reasons and has nothing to do with the evidence. People start smoking. Intelligent people begin to smoke. They know two things. It's harmful and addictive, and they start anyway. They do things contrary to evidence that will kill them. So the evidence could have been very strong for the resurrection, and people disbelieved it for whatever reasons. Let me venture some. We know, for example, about the Bar Kokhba rebellion, is that early after the Christian movement started, a number of Jews, one guy named Bar Kokhba actually set himself up as a Messiah. And the Messianic Jews, the budding movement, would not fight the Romans under the banner of a false Messiah. So they abandoned the fight, and the Jews were wiped out. They were wiped out. Now, many of the non-Messianic Jews who were looking at the Messianic Jews as people, compatriots, now saw them as traitors, and now they were suspicious of the movement. In fact, Richard Bauckham points out that that very incident is what caused a huge rift between the Messianic movement and the non-Messianics in Judea very early on. So they might have had political reasons not to agree with them. Plenty of reasons why not. In fact, here's an interesting fact. When Bar Kokhba was annihilated by the Romans, his followers refused to even acknowledge they knew him. So what you have in a Semitic culture, I come from a Semitic culture, I know what they're like. I know exactly what it's like. Our guy is the best guy. He died. I don't even know that guy. And that's what happened. But you know what's different? Jesus is fundamentally different than the false Messiah. Fundamentally different. He was nailed to a cross in humiliating defeat in front of the Romans, and his followers didn't deny knowing him. Well, they did before he died, but not after. You have to explain the burgeoning early church They didn't disown this man. Why not? Bar Kokhba died by starvation in some hole somewhere. Jesus arose from a hole somewhere, and that accounts for why his followers believed him and shouted from the rooftops and weren't willing to deny him, but willing to be crucified for his name. The statement of the prophecies. Well, I can actually give a couple of those things I think that are actually interesting responses. Talking to my Messianic Jewish friends, by the way, who know their Hebrew, who know their stuff, and will tell you, oh yeah, there's plenty of Messianic prophecies in there. I'll give you an example, the Isaiah 53. It's not about the servant Israel. It's not there. In fact, let me try to find it in my notes here so I can make sure oh, here it is, to make sure to respond adequately. Isaiah 53 has a subject-object distinction. There's an IU. This is the servant, and someone suffers for the servant. Well, the servant is Israel? Then Israel suffers for itself? The grammar doesn't work. In fact, Dr. Cyrus Gordon, a professor of NYU Hebrew, told a number of Orthodox Jews in his classes, he pointed out the grammatical impossibility of this being about Israel, and in fact it being about the Messiah. And in fact, Isaiah 53 only refers to Israel after a man named Rashi, Rabbi Rashi, in the 13th century conjured that up. Up until that time, all the rabbis said it was of the Messiah, and the rabbis rebuked him for saying it was about Israel. Friends, there's plenty of reasons to believe in the resurrection. Plenty of good reasons. We have eyewitness testimony. We convict people on eyewitness testimony of murder and other things and send them to jail or even to the gas chamber over this kind of thing. We have the eyewitness testimonies of the disciples. We have the eyewitness testimony of an enemy who becomes a Christian. We have all these kind of things that can convince us that's enough evidence for us to believe that the resurrection actually happened. We have to come up with some kind of weird story to say it didn't happen. That what accounts for them actually having seen something that convinced them Jesus raised. This is universally acknowledged, or at least close to universally acknowledged by many critical and non-critical, or I shouldn't say non-critical, but critical and Christian historians who study the subject. They believe they saw something that convinced them he was raised. You got to explain that. You can't just say, nope. You got to explain it. Let me show you this on probabilities and possibilities. This is a statement. It's very similar to what John said today. The more Christians constantly retreat to what is possible in order to defend their faith, the more their faith is on shaky ground. Why? Because we want to know what is probable, not what is possible. If we ask Christians to defend a particular belief and they argue such a belief isn't impossible, then this is a tacit admission that instead of evidence supporting what they believe, they're actually trying to explain away the evidence. The more often Christians are forced into arguing their faith is merely possible in the face of contrary evidence rather than probable, then the less likely it is that their faith is true. Every time they do this, they are explaining the evidence away by admitting the evidence does not support what they believe. Probability is what matters. You know who said that? John Loftus. Now let's change the words a little bit so we can make sure that when we point fingers, we all don't forget that fingers point back at us. I've given you a great case, I think, with the probability of the resurrection, at least the best explanation of it. The more atheists must constantly retreat to what is possible, no matter how improbable, in order to defend their objections. He didn't say that last part. The more their objection is on shaky ground. Why? Because we want to know what is probable, not what's possible. If we ask atheists to defend a particular objection, and they argue such an objection isn't impossible, then this is a tacit admission that instead of evidence supporting what they believe, they're actually trying to explain the evidence away. The more often atheists are forced into arguing their objection is merely possible in the face of contrary evidence rather than probable, then the less likely it is that their objection is true. Every time they do this, they are explaining the evidence away by admitting the evidence does not support what they believe. Probability is what matters. Friends, with that last statement, I think that's the reality of it. And I think the resurrection best explains what happened to Jesus. Thank you.
Thank you.
Abdu's good, isn't he? That last quote, I really appreciate when I'm getting quoted. It really makes sense. But remember, he turned it on around me as an atheist, but this was written by a Jew. See, an atheist would be anyone who disagrees with his Christianity. Michael Alter, then, is an atheist. That is, he's a non-believer. He doesn't believe in Christianity. So apparently it applies to believers like Alter, a theist, a Jew, who wasn't persuaded by the evidence that Abdu is presenting. See, I'm not alone in this. Hindus disagree with him, Muslims disagree with him, and I'm just here to report the results. It's fun to do. Actually, I can read what Christians say and report the results. That's what I did when it came to the apologetic methodology. I just simply reported the results. Christians themselves are saying the things that I reported about method. He talks about confirmation bias again. First you have to have something to believe for confirmation bias to kick in. So a Christian like himself has a belief in Christianity, and that's when the confirmation bias kicks in. And what I've done in the Outsider Test for Faith book is to try to eliminate or nullify the confirmation bias so that we can all apply the same standards to all religions across the board without it. And that is to look at your faith as an outsider would, someone who'd never heard about it before, and someone who's dispassionately trying to figure out whether or not it's true rather than confirm it, because that confirmation bias is the mother of all biases. It'll skew the results every time if you have a bias towards confirming what you believe. And so you should test your religious faiths as an outsider, a non-believer, an agnostic. Test them all the same way. And if God cannot produce the evidence to convince outsiders, then he didn't do his job. That's all there is to it. There'd be no reason to believe it if the correct faith could not pass that test. Now, I do think there was some kind of Jesus that died, but he may not have existed at all. In fact, there's probably a better case that he didn't exist than that he was the miraculous Jesus we find in the Gospels and that he rose from the dead. And if Mark was dictated by Peter, why didn't Peter dictate to him the resurrection sequence? John's gospel is unreliable. It's anti-Jewish. If you read the Gospel of John, it could not have been written by a Jew. It's anti-Jewish because in the Gospel of John, Jesus is reportedly saying, "You are of your father, the devil." He's talking to Jews. It's clearly anti-Semitic, the Gospel of John. That's why scholars don't believe the Gospel of John was written by anyone close to Jesus. Not a Jew anyway. The creed that he mentions in 1 Corinthians 15, where he's talking about this ancient creed, it doesn't mention an empty tomb. Now, why not? That's kind of significant. That's the number one piece of evidence that apologists bring up to fore. Explain away the empty tomb, they always say. Explain away the empty tomb. Well, Paul never mentions it. I mean, you would think that if that was such a key evidence, that Paul would have mentioned it, and he didn't. In fact, when it comes to James, someone who was converted apparently by a vision, Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 says, James saw Jesus just like I did. In fact, all these people saw Jesus just like I did, and in Damascus Road, we don't know what he saw. I mean, he doesn't say what he saw. He heard a voice. But in Acts chapter 26, verse 19, Paul said it was a vision. Acts chapter 26, verse 19. How many of you brought your Bibles here today? Come on, let's get a revival meeting going. Acts 26, verse 19 says, Paul said it was a vision. Now, we already know Paul has all kinds of visions. In fact, the Lord's Supper was given to him by a vision, and the whole gospel was given to him by a vision. So it's not anything new. And I'd like to see, when we come to the New Testament, the age of Jesus was not an age of critical reflection. I'm reading something that Richard Carrier wrote, a scholar of ancient Roman era. He said it was an era filled with con artists, gullible believers, martyrs without a cause, and reputed miracles of every variety. They had no newspapers, telephones, photographs, or public documents to consult to check the story. And then what we have is what we have. We have no original text. We have no first-hand reports, the things that I mentioned earlier. That's just not good enough evidence for me at all. I need something more than that if I'm an outsider. I need something tangible, if I could, to accept that. In fact, I did accept it at one time, and I did have confirmation bias to believe it. And as a budding scholar, a budding apologist, I did whatever I could to support my confirmation bias. But even though I had the proclivity to believe what I was taught, I still was able to say, you know what, this is wrong. And how wrong was it? Well, it was wrong, so wrong that I had to be sure I was right. And the reason why I had to be sure that Christianity was a delusion was because I always had that fear of hell thrown over me, like Abdu said with the Muslim God as well. I had that fear of hell hanging over my head, that if I got it wrong, I would go to hell. So I had to be sure I was right. So there's nothing he said today that is important enough for me to reconsider how I've come to what I've believed, because it just isn't there. The evidence is just not there. Sufficient evidence is not there. Christian apologists say that. They come up with different methods because the evidential method just doesn't work. Just listen to them. Listen to them argue this case. The evidence isn't there, so let's come up with a different method. What does that tell you? Theism would never be around if the evidence was there. Reformed theology would never be around if the evidence was there. The cumulative case would never be around if the evidence was there. Neither would the classical method or presuppositionalism. None of those methods would be around if the evidence were there. Now he's giving you the evidence. You know, oh yeah, right, sure, that's fine. That'll convince some people who already believe. Because that's what evidence leads to when it comes to Christians and apologists. It's all special pleading. Only those who already believe will believe it. There is no empirical evidence, no original text, no first-handed testimony, no prophetic evidence, contrary to what he said. We could get into that. And no corroborative evidence. The Jews were there. They saw. They were beloved of God, and yet they didn't believe. He says, oh, I don't know, and neither does John. Well, you know what? I do know. Because I've examined the evidence pretty closely, as the Jews recounted, and it doesn't seem like the evidence is there. See, they had every reason to think that Jesus should have been the Messiah. It's just that they didn't believe that he was. They had every reason to think he did the miracles, but they didn't believe him. They had every reason to investigate the resurrection, and they went away not believing. They were there. They didn't believe, and because they didn't believe, they're my Johnny on the spot. They were there. They didn't believe, even though they saw everything that was available to be seen. They had every way to investigate it, and they didn't believe. So Paul had to take off and convert the Gentiles. There's just isn't enough evidence to believe, and I leave 2 minutes to Abdu for rebuttal. I got 2 minutes. You know what? Just want to sing a song? Kumbaya or something. I can't believe I got 2 minutes, and I'm done. All right.
Okay. Actually, both are going to stand. At your respective microphones, this is time. 7 minutes are allotted for cross-examination, going back and forth between the two speakers. So, once we can get this set up, then yes. And the way, well, I'll leave it to each of you to decide which one wants to do cross-examination first. But
go ahead, Abdu.
7 minutes apiece. Sure. No throwing of anything, John. John, in your books and in other debates, and
I'm glad you read them.
Yeah, thanks. In other debates as well, when I believe you might have said it here as well. You made the statement today. In fact, you did say it, that the early ancient times was marked with gullibility and people who would just believe any old thing, right? That they weren't critical thinkers and these kind of things. Yet in your book and in your debate with David Wood, you made this statement that the empty tomb had to be made up and the guard story had to be made up to convince people of what amounted to a fantastic story. So here's my question for you. If people were gullible, why didn't they just believe when they said, we saw a vision of Jesus? Why did they have to make up the story at all? If they were gullible, they wouldn't have to make up the story at all because they wouldn't be gullible. They'd be critical thinkers. So why make up the story if they don't have to?
Okay, all right. Well, you know what? It does make it more believable if you have a made-up story.
But why do you need to make it more believable?
Well, I understand your point, but let's just say it did run across some people. I mean, not everybody was gullible. I never said that. Carrier doesn't say everyone was gullible.
I said characterized by. The whole time was characterized by a bunch of morons, apparently.
They were pre-scientific people who were superstitious. They believed in an evil eye. Let me give you an example of what an evil eye is. Don't look at my eye because it's evil. And if you look into my eye, I could be emanating particles from my eye that might actually make you into a very self-absorbed person. They believed that back there. You can find it in the text in the Bible itself. Jesus and Paul said as much. We can get the quotes on it if you want. Those kinds of things are there. They believed in all sorts of things. So not everybody had the non-questioning gullibility, but it was permeated by that. Is the point. And I think that the stories grew in an evolutionary way, and things were added to it. I don't see any problem.
Well, aside from the fact that in order to, if they were permeated by gullibility, then to create an entire story and circulate that in the Gospel of Matthew, and then lie about the lie that you lied about, just seems an utterly unnecessary act. If, in other words, your explanation is looking for something to explain.
Well, the one thing is that Matthew has a story about guards at the tomb, and Luke, a later gospel, denies that story ever happened. Because in Luke's gospel...
Well, it doesn't deny it, this doesn't include it.
Well, that's true, but he said in the very first 2 verses of his gospel, I've investigated everything, O Theophilus, and I'm going to tell you the truth of what happened. He didn't say leaving nothing out, but he says, I'm going to tell you the truth of what happened. And then he ignored the guards at the tomb story, which was added for the gullibility of the choir, which Luke decided, we don't even need that gullible story, because it can't be true. What did the guards see? When were they placed? So Luke says, so let's go back to gullibility. We don't need that. He denies what Matthew reported.
And other than the way you've sort of woven that story,
That's
it's got
pretty good.
literally zero evidence.